Then I'm presenting to you today ARCHE, which ARCHE is an acronym that stands for a Resource Center for the Humanities. And ARCHE is a digital archive for the humanities, and it implements the OAIS reference model for an open archival information system. So OAIS stands for Open Archival Information System. It has the following URL, and we're going to have a look at it later. So, but first hand, what is an archive? An archive primarily preserves information for access and for use. And in the special case of digital archives compared to other repositories, like for example in libraries or Dropboxes or something, an archive is committed to the long-term preservation of files, so that you can, for example, still use them in more than 10 years and even longer. And if you want to have a good archive, you should adhere to the OAIS reference model. Which means that you need a solid technical basis for storing and preserving your data. Then you also need good metadata schema that you can use for discovery and dissemination of the resources. You will also need a user interface so that the data is not only stored, but it's also findable and usable by the users. And you also need policies and documentation to be a transparent archive, so that the depositors know what happens with their data when they're deposited. The history of ARCHE is as follows. It supersedes the Clarion Center for the Clarion Center Vienna, the language resources portal, which was only focused on digital language resources and was active from 2014 until 2017. And in 2017, we set up ARCHE. All resources from the language resource portal were migrated, and the new thing about ARCHE is that it's designed for a broader spectrum of data from all humanities fields, so that we not only have language resources, but for example also archaeological resources and data for historians, and everything is presented together. What kind of data do we take and preserve? Basically it's everything. We have plain text, text documents, PDF documents, images, spreadsheets, databases, audio files, video files, 3D files, geographical information systems, and whatever somebody comes up with. But we have to make sure that files are provided in formats that are suitable for long-term preservation. Which means, for example, maybe you remember when Microsoft Word changed the version to 2015 or something, and we had the format doc and docx, and then doc wasn't working anymore. So we want to make sure we don't take such formats that are mostly commercial formats, but we try to take open formats that won't change that suddenly. Then we also have to store some metadata for the files. Why? Because you want to understand and discover and share the data. And the metadata is there to explain how the data was created, who created it, and who were the participants, and what was created, and what is the data meant for. And we're trying to, so another important term to know is the FAIR data principles, which means that you make sure that your data and metadata is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. We had some challenges when we were trying to set up our metadata schema, because since we're not only focused on language data, but on a broader humanities field, we have a very homogeneous heterogeneous data set. And we also have to support multiple metadata schemas. So for example, from the language resources, you might have different TAI headers or CMDI records. Then from archaeology, there are other standards or non-standards coming in. And then you also want to serve metadata to other services via Dublin Core, for example, or via the European data model if you want to provide, if you want to disseminate data to European distributors. So our metadata schema is public and is on GitHub, and we'll have a short look at it. This is the GitHub page. Basically, the metadata schema is written down in an OL file, which is XML-like notation. And visualized, it looks about like this. So at the center we have the resource that has attached a lot of. So we can represent relations. So for example, that a resource is related to another resource, and we can even state a bit that, for example, the relation is citing it or it's part of. Then we also have collections, resources, metadata, and what do we have here? We have agents, so that's persons and organizations that are involved in the making of a resource. They can be funders, they can be contributors, authors, principal investigators, and so on. We can also represent projects, and yeah, here are the agents. And somewhere there should be a class for places, because we can also represent the places with identifiers to reference where the resource exactly, so not only where the resource was made, but especially which geographic coverage the resource is about. So if, for example, you have a collection of some archaeological finds, you would also like to state that these finds come from Vienna. We also have another view for the metadata schema, which is a tabular overview. This is a bit easier, and the whole metadata schema also contains the documentation in itself. So these comments are inside the OL file, so that in the perfect case, the metadata schema is understandable as it from itself. Yeah. Okay. So our metadata can be harvested via OIE PMH. Are you familiar with it? Yes, no, not really. Okay, OIE PMH is a harvesting protocol for metadata, and OIE is the open archival information, the open archival initiative. And with this protocol, you can send, you can do it manually, but you can also do it with a script. When you do it manually, you enter an URL into the browser and attach a part about OIE PMH asking for example, all attributes the archive is storing. And with this protocol, other systems can harvest our metadata, not the data, only metadata, so the information about the data we have in there. And then, for example, the Virtual Language Observatory, which is provided by Clarine, can also harvest the information we have about language resources and present them. And then when you go to the Virtual Language Observatory, you find our resources and can be sent back to Arche to see them. Yeah, let's look at the live system of Arche. This is the starting page. We have like 2 entry points. We have one that is discovering resources, and the other one is depositing resources. For the depositing, we're coming there later. Let's just look what we have in there. So here are the latest 3 additions. This is a collection that is, it's a mix of archaeology and language resources, because it contains squeezes of, so squeezes are made on inscriptions of stones, and these squeezes were scanned, and the inscriptions were also transliterated and in TEI files. So in the overview, you already see a small set of the metadata we are storing. In this case, for example, we are now in a sub-collection of the whole collection. We have the creators, that are these 3 people. We have the date when this collection was made publicly available. We have an automated calculated number of how many items this collection contains, as well as how big it is. A very important part is the license part. I think you already heard something about legal issues yesterday. So this is something put in practice, because when you want to disseminate collections, you should provide a license so that users know how they are allowed to use it. We also have some different levels of access restrictions. This one is public, so everybody can see and use it. For other collections, there might be a login required. We have the data from this project is also presented in a web application, so we also have a link to the web page where it is presented a bit differently, with a dedicated interface just for this object, which gives you an idea what we're dealing with here. So this in the top is a picture of the squeeze, and then we have, yeah, it looks like we don't have any inscription on this particular squeeze. We also provide persistent identifiers for the resources, which means that the data is not only long-term preserved and stored, but the link to get to the data is also a long-term link, ideally everlasting link. Yeah. Then we have the different files, which in this case then are resources. And in this case, we are dealing with some images and a 3D object. Okay. Then if we look at the so this is what we at the moment are storing, or the data collections we now have in Arche. It's only 6 collections, but they contain many images and many files. Yeah, maybe something interesting as well. If you look for different entities, let's say, for example, for a place, and you choose the place, then you get the detailed view of the place, which might contain might contain even coordinates and the display on a map. This one does not, but the most important part is that this place is used in this collection. So you can also navigate from the place side and try to see if you're interested, for example, in Vienna, to see what is which collections are related to Vienna. And the same is valid for persons. For example, if you're interested in a particular researcher and would like to know what else he has done and archived, then you can look for persons and even organizations. Okay. So this is the part what we have and what you can see now. The other interesting part is how do you get data into Arche. For this we have a deposition process, which involves quite a lot of work on your side, but also a lot of work on our side. Although we try to keep our work a bit minimal, just to keep costs a bit low, which is also good for you, because then you wouldn't have to pay that much. So in the first phase, you will have to inform yourself about the collection policy, which basically means, does your collection fit into the things we are willing to collect? So for example, if you have a collection of taxonomies for insects, we would say, no, that's not the right place to come to us, please go somewhere else. But if you have, for example, a collection of taxonomy of insects, where you researched how the taxonomies might have evolved, so language-wise might have evolved during time, then you could come to us. Then you also have to enrich the files with metadata. For this, we provide a metadata table where you can look up which fields we are asking for. You also have to make sure that the formats are in the right format we would like to. You should think about how you would like to license your collection. And you also have to keep in mind some special legal issues. So for example, if you're coping with sensitive data, so for example in archaeology, in some cases you don't want to give the exact coordinates of a find place, because otherwise it would be in danger. Or if you're having, let's say, some interviews, you don't want to publish information about the persons that were interviewed, like for example religion and ethnics and all that. So these are all things you have to try to sort out. Then, so this is this place here. Then you contact us and tell us, yeah, I would like to archive, and we will say yes, come to us. But please, please do this preparation, which means you actually have to prepare your data. Then you can send it to us, which when you're speaking archive languages, you're producing an SIP, a submission information package, that is sent to us. We first processes it automatically to make sure that the formats are correct, the file naming is correct. Also, if metadata is already provided. And then if the automatic checking was successful, we actually look at the data and especially look at if we can enrich metadata. We also will set up deposition agreement, which is a contract that states what is your part and what is our part, and which also states that you're not losing the rights on your data. It's still yours. You're just giving us the right to publish it and to preserve it. And we would also have a look at legal issues that you might have overseen or not addressed correctly. Then there's some further automatic processing so that we get to the archival information package, which is a bit different from the submission information package. And this package then is archived, which means it goes into our systems, and these systems are backed up in different places. But from this archival information package, we also get the dissemination information package, which means that is the files and data you actually see on the browser at the end, so that you can see it, use it, reuse it, and then can start with a new collection. And this is the life cycle of data as well. In practical terms, so for example, for the Tunico collection, this one, which is a collection of interviews and audio files from the Tunis area, and consists and it consists of maybe this one's better. It consists of audio files with their transcription in an XML format, and it also contains an XML file with a dictionary. So what you want to do is first check if the file naming is correct, because we don't accept, for example, empty spaces, special characters, and even some punctuation. We don't accept it in the file formats. Then you will have to check the formats. So, for example, for the audio files, you wouldn't want to use an MP3 file because it's lossy. So it means when you save it multiple times, it always gets compressed and always some bit of information gets lost, and at some point you might lose the actual. So at some point you might even at some point you might not be able to even open it and listen to it. Then you would also want to enrich metadata as much as you can. The more metadata you provide, the better other users can understand and work with your data. And then you will also have to, especially in this case, make sure that no sensitive data is contained in the files, or otherwise that consent was given to publish this data. So for example, if you have images of people, you might want to have consent from those people depicted on the images that they're fine with archiving images from them. And then you can send it to us. Yeah, that's basically it. If you want to know more, you can have a look at Arche, where we have our extensive documentation with the deposition process described in more detail, also which file formats and metadata we would like to have. We're also describing how the technical part of the system is done, and we have the different policies that explain which things we do take and which not, and we have the deposition agreement and so on. So, and we also have a video. Are you interested in seeing a video? Do you have any questions?